Hello.
Hi.
Okay. Hi, Amanda. Could you introduce yourself briefly for us?
Of course. So, my name is Amanda Cercas Curry, and I'm a postdoc researcher at Bocconi University in Milan. And I work on natural language processing and ethics. So, I'm particularly interested in bias and fairness in
And
it.
you also have a side activity as a
Yes, of
podcast
course.
host, right?
Yes, of course. Actually, yes. Stemming from that interest, I guess I have a podcast that I co-host with my friend and ex-colleague, former colleague, Oriana Medlicott, where we touch on all kinds of aspects of tech ethics. So we're not limited to specifically AI, but more broadly, even things like dating apps. And we invite like book authors. We've had representatives even from the UK government to talk about regulation, etc. So we talk about all of these things for a more general public. No, it's not for practitioners.
Yeah, I've listened to a few episodes. They are great. For the Pi for AI conference, could you tell us what topic you are presenting?
Of course. So, like I said, one of my topics that I'm really interested in is bias in natural language processing. And so I thought I would focus on that and particularly on how we can try to find these biases and address them in a way that they don't affect our systems in a negative way, particularly for our users.
Mm-hmm. And what inspired you to choose this topic?
I think that it's a topic that's very close to my heart, that I think it's very important, particularly in a time where AI systems or really technology is more and more part of everybody's daily life, that we really cannot get away from it. And so I think it's really crucial that these systems are beneficial to everyone and that they serve everybody in the same way, and certainly not leave out specific groups. Something that I would really want to highlight and something that I would really want to bring to the forefront for developers and practitioners and everybody that's working and using AI systems or really any technology.
No, I wanted to ask you also, what are in your from your perspective the most important and challenging part of developing an ethical AI?
I think it's probably that the ethical issues that can come up with AI are so pervasive and they come in at every level of the development. So it's really hard to, I think, for most people to even have an idea of where to look for them, right? Because I think we have an idea that bias is maybe coming from, or ethical issues, they arise from an imbalanced data set, right? And that's going to represent, let's say, stereotypes. But it's not just about the data set. And I think you can mitigate some of the issues that a data set might have if you can really place that data set in the context that it was collected in. But there are elements about the other parts of the data collection, right? Like where people paid fairly for the data they provided and things like that. When you're training a model on this data, there are many things, right? Like a lot of the techniques that help a model generalize better to a data set actually introduce more biases. Of course, you can think about the way the system is being used and developed. So it's so pervasive that it's really hard, I think, for most people and most developers to get a full picture of what can be happening. And I think also it's not always super straightforward, right? Like in AI ethics, they have to talk about the tension between values. So if you think about the trade-off between privacy and a really useful system or a system that works better, maybe you have to make some decisions there that I think can be hard, and that's probably, I think, it's a minefield, I would say.
Yeah. So will you be able to provide some guidance for the developers and users of this in your presentation to help us travel through this minefield?
I hope so. I'm hoping to really give at least some very pragmatic things. I think there are some issues that you have to make the decision day by day and have like ongoing discussions and that's those sorts of things. But there are very actionable things that you can take into account, like thinking about what what is your data set, right? If you are training a model, what is your data set actually representing? So I just did some really fun work with fun sort of work with a friend. We were looking at emotional, friend and colleague, at stereotypes in large language models. And we found, for example, that these models think that women are always sad and crying about everything and men are always very angry. And so I think, yeah, really thinking about what that data set is actually teaching a model is very much more practical than maybe a lot of the thinking about the tensions and the big picture values, maybe.
Mm-hmm. That's great. And do you have expectations about the conference Pi for AI? What are you looking forward?
I'm really looking forward to meeting people who are working really with these systems more like as a product, because as an academic, I think we live in a bit of a bubble sometimes, right? And it's like almost like an ivory tower where we have this, we can think about what's good and all of that, but at the end of the day, what are the real practical problems that you are facing when you're working on this sort of thing? So I'm really looking forward to meeting people like that can give me their perspective and to really understand what are the issues that they're coming across in their day-to-day work and their day-to-day life. I think that'd be really exciting.
Thank you. We are very happy to have you.
If I can ask a few questions.
Yes, go ahead.
Because you mentioned the bias, so I am very curious.
Yeah, actually, there are so many. It's actually, sometimes it's a little bit funny, but there's many ways in which AI systems end up stereotyping. So we've seen really horrendous ones. It's not even only limited to language, but I don't know if you remember, for example, Google had this image caption generation software that would label Black people as gorillas. And that's I think it's a slur in most languages. So that was very problematic, and it turned out that it was partly because if their solution was that they have banned gorillas from being labeled in pictures. It's like they couldn't fix it really. So it was a really, but you find these things all the time. Then, for example, in my group, we work a lot on misogyny and sexism detection. And what happens is sometimes the models generalize too much. And so anything that mentions a woman or she gets labeled as like misogynistic, right? Just because you're saying she or her, or referring to women in some ways. And we found that also in that work we just did on emotional stereotypes, that if you asked system, how would a woman feel in this situation? It would say that it's not appropriate to talk about that, but for a man, it was actually totally fine. So by generalizing, you can introduce a lot of these sort of problems.
Ongoing debate on what is considered misogynistic and what is political correctness. Where is the line? How do you train AI?
Really complicated issue, because when we think about something being misogynistic, it's a horrible thing. Nobody wants to be a misogynist. And so I think we often think that something can only be misogynistic if it's considered offensive, right? But the reality is that we have actually fairly clear definitions of what sexism is, for example. And it refers to essentially stereotyping people based on their sex, right? And so as long as something is stereotyping women, let's say the idea of women being nurturing and empathetic, that's quite nice, right? I mean, there's nothing, I want to be empathetic and nurturing. I think everybody would
Nothing wrong with that.
Yeah.
Me too.
Exactly, but it's sexist because it's stereotyping based on sex in a way that I think is not appropriate, right? But it's not really that offensive. When we have all these positive stereotypes, it doesn't mean that they're not also harmful. So what we are trying to do now in trying to understand what's sexism and what isn't, and in order to train models to better do that, is to try to separate what is offensive from what is actually sexist, right? Because there are many things that are sexist that are not offensive, and these things change with time, right? Like being homophobic was very acceptable in the 80s. Nowadays, it's not very socially acceptable to say homophobic things, but it doesn't mean that homophobes don't exist, right? And so by trying to separate those things out, we are trying to develop better data sets, but it's not that straightforward, because you have to have humans label data sets for those things, and humans don't, like, it's a hard concept to get around. You know, you have to find experts in this, and in order to collect a large enough data set, it's hard. So it's not super straightforward, but I think the two things are more clearly separate and defined than we often think they are.
I see. Because the definition of offensive varies from person to person, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, I think this is offensive, but that person doesn't think so. And then how do you collect enough people who categorize these things as offensive or not?
It's much more complicated than it seems, because it's even not just limited to the number of people, right? But it changes from culture to culture. Like, to me, there are like, I'm not Italian, but there are many things that I think in Italy are quite socially acceptable, and to me are really rude, right? Like, quite offensive. I think, like, Italians are very direct, and in other countries that's considered really not kosher, let's say.
You should speak to Dutch people.
They are also even more direct, you're right. I think then you also, like I said before, these things also change over time, and so you have to try to keep changing it. But it's also the question of whether it's offensiveness that we have to care about, or if it's something else, right? Like, maybe it doesn't, like, I don't know, I think about, it's not really language related, but you know, the issue of women's nipples on Instagram, right? That you're not allowed, you're allowed to post men's nipples, but no women's nipples. I think maybe now they've changed it. But in a way, there's nothing inherently offensive about a nipple, but some people get offended, right? Because, but is it really harmful? So I would argue that, you know, I mean, maybe it's context dependent, but it's not that harmful. Instead, I think we think about sexism and we think about something that is not offensive, right? Like this idea that, yeah, women are empathetic. It's not offensive, I think, for most people, but it is probably harmful, right? We know that the stereotypes that we have about men and women affect, like, the professions that men and women are accepted in or tend to go towards, right? Like, women are rarer in STEM because we think that you need to be super rational for this. And instead, women are more common, or they tend to work more in, like, as teachers or nurses, where you need this, like, emotional care, right? So these things can be harmful when they lead to inequality. And so there's also this philosopher who wrote a whole theory of offense, and he basically said, like, we give offense more attention than it deserves. There's no, like, moral reason to defend somebody who's offended by something. What we should care about is whether that thing is actually harmful and morally wrong. And so now there's, like, a bit of a debate as to what we need to address on social media, right? Like, many of the things that big social media platforms allow are harmful, but they're maybe not offensive because they're socially acceptable. And some things are offensive, like the nipple, but they're not necessarily harmful. So it's actually, I think, a big philosophical debate and question, and a matter of priorities, I guess.
That's very interesting. And in trying to measure these things, so you mentioned annotators that are needed, but I was wondering something I forgot to ask before about bias. How do you define bias, and how does it connect with this kind of concepts of harmful, offensive, if there is a connection in a sense?
Yeah, of course. So I think bias is a very broad term. So bias can refer to something like this, right? The idea that you have a system that allows sexist things to be said, right? So if you have a hate speech detection model, so one famous example is the N-word, right? So it's a slur for Black people, but that word is used a lot by people who speak Black English, or like African American vernacular English. And so when they use it, it's not offensive, right? It matters who is using the term. But what we found is that a lot of hate speech detection systems, they use white annotators, or we assume that the person that is saying it is white. And so they overtly censor Black speakers or speakers of African American vernacular English. And so now the system is biased in two ways. One, in that it's affecting, like, disproportionately affecting one one type of user, right? So speakers of African American vernacular English, but it's also biased in that it doesn't speak everybody's language, right? So when we don't separate these two concepts, we can end up with a system that is biased in that way, right? So yeah, to refer to bias when you're more looking at sort of the performance and the services that it's offering different groups of users, I think is a complex issue. And how that relates to these terms of offensiveness or not is that partly, for example, the N-word is like, I would say, one of the most profoundly offensive words in the English language, I think, for a lot of people. I think that and like the C word, my mom will never allow me to say that for sure. I mean, N-word, I would not say it, but the C word, my mom always says, don't say that, Amanda, right? But by not treating a word that is used by different people differently, appropriately, we are creating a system that is essentially racist, right? If you're overly censoring Black people. And similarly, it happens with other reclaimed slurs, like if a lot of women might use like call each other like bitches or things like that. That is also a slur, a sexist slur, but if it's reclaimed and the systems don't stand up to that, then yeah, it's sort of a bit also sexist. I don't know if I explained it very well.
So, in a sense, bias is sensible to the context, and there are some kind of contexts that are less represented, and in a way, this is a bias itself.
Yes, exactly. And I think to your sort of point about the annotators, right? If we have a more diverse and more informed group of annotators, then we can certainly model these concepts a little bit better than we can if we have only white middle class 60-year-old Americans, probably, right?
I guess it's not also standard practice to have, I don't know if it's a standard practice now to have a kind of model card for annotators or to be transparent about this kind of things.
So some people are pushing for it. I think it's good. Some people are worried then about the annotator's privacy, right? But the thing is, I don't think that all your demographic, like saying that you are I don't know. I mean, I'm a woman between the ages of 30 and 35. I'm white and I live in Italy. I was born in Spain. I think that doesn't violate my privacy too much. And I think as an annotator, I might be willing to give up that sort of information for the sake of ethics and equality and to really keep track of the data sets. There's calls for even more information about the annotators to be kept, like some aspect of their socioeconomic status, because we know that has a huge impact on our language use. And that's something that affects how NLP systems, for example, behave with different users. But there's still not like a lot of standard practice there. So usually the thing that we report is we used this many annotators, 50% were men and 50% were women. Things particularly, I think, in hate speech more than other things, because we know that there's this problem, for example, with the different communities using language differently. But certainly they're not, the issue is not solved. And part of the other problem is if we need a large enough pool of annotators, they have to be usually they're crowd workers, which means they're like just normal people. But maybe for something like sexism and racism and stuff, you should try to find experts, right? People who work in this area who are more trained to find harmful statements rather than people who will just get a little bit triggered by saying like specific words.
I could have another question, but we are rambling a bit. Tao, as moderator, do you want to keep us?
No, it's really interesting. Please ask away.
I was wondering, it's not specific to the talk, I think, but I was wondering, what are your thoughts on the techniques of AI safety in order to keep track of models? If you have an opinion on that. Thinking more of the techniques in large language models to try to make a certain model behave in a specific way and not say certain things. So
I think, okay, this is a really difficult problem. I think most people don't really realize how incredibly hard it is, right? So mostly, I think what they do now is this sort of like learning from human feedback, reinforcement learning from human feedback, where basically they have people interacting with the system and literally giving it some feedback about, don't say this, say this instead, right? And I mean, we've seen that can help a lot. The problem is that we still have no good way of controlling the outputs of the model. So we know that you can quite easily trick the system into answering wrong questions. Like if you say, oh, this is for a book, and then it might tell you the thing that it's not supposed to say, right? Or you have the exact opposite problem, right? This sort of exaggerated safety, they're calling it now, where it won't respond to perfectly harmless queries because it's overgeneralizing. Probably for now, the best technique that we have, but we know that I am not sure that it's going to be the way forward. I think we're going to, and I think that there are people already working on this, a more abstract way of representing these concepts, but it's such a hard problem when you think about what language models are really doing, right? Just sort of keeping a statistical model of language, then you can fix it in some way. But anything that you want to say in human language, there's literally an infinite number of ways that you can ask it and say it. And so to expect that we can fix everything in such a way that we can do this, and the other thing is that humans are incredibly creative at poking holes in any safety measure, then the more companies or developers try to make these models safer by addressing these issues, the more the models become kind of useless. What is really great about language models now, like the thing that I think really brought them forward, was all of the things that they can answer to. And I mean, they have a lot of problems, right? They have all the hallucinations and all of that, but they still seem like magic. And so one thing I think that is going to be important for safety is that what is safe and unsafe changes from person to person, right? Like things that are safe for adults are not safe for children. But at the moment, like the only way that you have to make sure that you're not talking to a child, and definitely over the age of 18, is not a problem, but you have no way of checking that, right? And it's not even just like, okay, I think when I say something that's safe for adults and not for children, everybody probably thinks about sex things, but it could be something even silly like, does Santa Claus exist, right? To a child, you might want to lie to them, and in a way that's a kind of a hallucination, but that really matters. And at the moment, we have no reliable way of controlling that, and no reliable way of knowing who the person is. Because also, even some of the very unsafe things, again, they might be safe actually if you are responding to an adult. Those things are going to remain challenges if we want the models to be safe but useful. And so I think we're going to partly have to be better at the user modeling side of things. And again, that is going to come into tension with the privacy issues once more. So very, very complicated issue that I think we're going to have to see developing slowly. And then I wonder if also with the new EU AI Act, because that asks for companies to make sure that the systems respond accurately, and they have certain safety standards that I think for now the technology is not there to meet really.
Okay, that's very interesting. I think we are at time.
Awesome.
Let's see this interview on the YouTube of Argo Vision. Okay. Will be
cool. Great. Let me know, and I can tweet it, and maybe my lab can tweet it. All right. Then if that's everything, see you soon.
Yep. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Amanda.
Bye, Amanda.
Again.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
You too.
You too.
Ciao.
Bye-bye.